Many people believe that the Civil War was a war over slavery, and that is not an incorrect assertion. What is incorrect is that the Civil War was a war fought by Northern whites against Southern whites, being a war of morality. When you think about freedom, you have personal freedom and you have civic freedom. Your civic freedom is the ability to function in your society, generally politically. Your personal freedom is at root the freedom to control and benefit from your labor. All right. And both of these types of freedoms were at root in the Civil War. But there were freedoms independent of the enslaved or the racially oppressed black people, quote unquote, free black people in the North and the enslaved black people in the South. There was not an egalitarian nature of whites that led to the Civil War. The Civil War was about the expansion of slavery or the expansion or the creation of a white middle class. There are very nuanced conversations about what started the Civil War, but for the purpose of this video, I'm going to really narrow it down to just basic. The rich people were paying taxes in the 90 percentile, okay? And they wanted to construct a system as to where the poor people would pay the bulk of the taxes. So what you have to understand first is that the American government is a corporation. That's it. It's a corporation designed to pay for things rich people don't want to pay for and manage things rich people don't want to manage. This country was found on business, all right? So they don't want to pay for you to get to their jobs and home. They just want you to have the ability to do it. Public transportation. There is a degree of intellect you have to have for their different jobs to continue making them richer, but they don't want to train you. So they made public education. They don't want to build your house, but obviously you're going to need somewhere to live. Public housing. I don't want to pay for these things, so I have to create a mechanism or a system that someone else pays for. So the country already was made from the colonies of a dynamic of belongingness, of who belonged, white men, versus Native Americans, Mexicans, Chinese, and black people. So when they had to choose who they were going to financially empower, the Western expansion, because now it's new land. And this is the removal of Mexican people, which we don't hear a lot of. We hear a lot, 3 groups had major removals in this country. The removal of Native Americans, which is the only group that they actually called a removal. It's called the Indian Removal Act. Then you had colonization, where they were trying to take black people and remove them from the country. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is where they moved the Mexicans from here, where they annexed Texas and took all the way to the western border, California. In that taking of Mexican land, that was described as a treaty. So that's pretty odd. You had three types of removal: blacks, Indians, Mexicans, but they called it colonization, an act, and a treaty. Same people doing it, meaning the United States government, the white power structure, was removing three different groups, and they called each removal three different things: an act, a treaty, and colonization. Very strange. But in that taking of this Mexican land, they're now deciding what's going to happen with that land. And we have two different groups of white people that have two different economies. The Industrial Revolution has made industry the primary economic force in the North, because it wasn't that the Northern people were any kinder toward black people. We know that all the way into the 60s, that you had racism in the North. But agriculture and climate made year-round slavery not a good investment in the North. So that's why they dropped slavery. They didn't drop slavery because there were morally sensitive white people in the North. That was not why it happened. It just wasn't economically feasible. You got snow in Chicago half the year. We're just not going to be able to run an agricultural economy. And what are these slaves going to be doing while there's no work outside? I'm just paying for somebody to be walking around. So you have this northern economy that is looking for this tax relief for the rich. You have the southern economy that's looking for this economic base and growth. They need to develop a labor force because it's just rich and poor in the North. They need to develop a labor force that can add money into the system that drops down the rich's obligation. The South already has rich people with a free workforce. They don't want to change their system. But Northern and Southern legislators are in the Senate and Congress. So they're debating on what's going to happen with this land that has been taken from Native Americans and Mexicans, meaning the western part of the continent. The North wanted to give land to poor whites. Homestead Act, the gold rush, when everybody was going out there getting land, $5 Indians. They were creating an economic floor for poor whites, where you can get acres and acres of land, make money to put into this system that decreases this expense for the rich. That was the point. The South is saying, well, we want to expand because all we need, one, cotton is really hard on the land, and people really hadn't figured out how to rotate where they were planting. So once it took a while for the nutrients to build back in the land, so they were trying to go to, newer areas where they can continue to plant. And therein lied the problem. This was not an awakening of white men dying for the cause and care of black people. That just is not true. So when people are saying the Union Army freed the slaves, it's not what happened. That's not even their intention. And it's not even logical to think that way, because if I'm thinking that there is any degree of equality, why was it racism in the military when the blacks were allowed to participate in the military? Why was it still segregated? The same thing that was going on in society did not change in the military. And then after the Civil War, you still had convict leasing, you had black codes, you had Jim Crow, you had segregation, you had Brown versus Board of Education resistance, you had civil rights resistance. You had 100 years of solid, legislated, inferior, invoked legislation to demote or maintain blacks in a second-class citizenship. So it's not even logical to think that white Northerners were fighting on behalf of black people. They were fighting on behalf of themselves, and their interests had nothing to do with the liberation of black people. There has not been a time in our recorded history where whites have systematically in this country had a vested interest in black progression or liberation. In fact, the opposite is true, that there has always been a time that whenever black people organized, there were white people, and including up to the United States government, to infiltrate those organizations, disassemble those organizations, and to monitor those organizations. And that could be abolitionists, that could be the Garvey movement, that could be the Nation of Islam, that could be the Civil Rights Movement, that could be any Black Lives Matter. We can go on. So, how did blacks have a role and actual slavery have a role in the Civil War? That occurred with the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, to understand the Emancipation Proclamation, you say, well, Lincoln did the Emancipation Proclamation, so he freed the slaves. No, you have to remember that there was a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. And you got to read it. Look it up. It's easy. The original Emancipation Proclamation actually said, let's take all the black folks and ship them out of the country. Read it. Google. If you don't believe me, look at it right now. That's what it says. Because he could not get the support, not because white people did not want that to happen. White people have been trying to ship black people out of the country since 1816. This is 1863. Okay? So it's not that white people did not want to ship black people out. They have been trying that with an organization called the American Colonization Society. So shortly after they finished forming the country, because you got the Emancipation, you had the Declaration of Independence, 1776. And then in the 1786, you had the Constitution, 1782, one of those two. And so by the time they got all of the structural documents together in this American experiment in democracy, because this is something new they're trying, they were deciding who's going to participate, which groups are going to participate. Well, we knew white women definitely are not going to participate. But the groups that had to be judged if they were going to stay, go, or assimilate was very unique, okay? They felt Mexicans had a place to go. So they told them, you got to go to this part of your country. We're taking the rest. This is ours. That was called Manifest Destiny, all right? We got the right to take whatever we want. You go to the rest of your country. We got this. They figured we brought black folks from Africa, so we're going to send them back either to Africa or to a black nation. And the two places that they were trying to send them, which was mentioned in the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, is Haiti and Liberia, which I'm going to cover more. Not in this video, though. So when you get to the Emancipation Proclamation, the preliminary one says, we're going to ship black folks out. That December 1862, Lincoln presents to Congress that he wants to make the 13th Amendment the I just got distracted. He wanted to make the 13th Amendment colonization. So Lincoln actually tried to make removing black people part of the governing document of the country. So it's a whole lot of reason that we need to gain an understanding of the 16th president. Abraham Lincoln is the most famous and most popular United States president. Famous and popular are not the same thing. Even though Lerone Bennett Jr. is not a historian, this is the Bible of Lincoln criticism. Now, I will get into a book review of that later. In fact, I think it's a book review of this book on this channel. You can look it up. But Lincoln wanted colonization to be the 13th Amendment. Congress wasn't trying to put that kind of money behind it. It just wasn't realistic because they were hoping that black people would volunteer to go, as opposed to having another forced migration, which is just not a good national look. The North was losing the war, and that was why Lincoln gave the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation to give people warning to say, look, we can keep slavery the way it is if you guys just come back to the Union and we can work things out. So that is far from the egalitarian Lincoln that we have been taught about. That's just, it's just not true. It's not that he was good or bad. That's just a misrepresentation of who he was. That is not that's not who he was. That's not what he did. That's not even how he represented himself. So, because the United States was losing the war, and I mean, not the United States, I'm sorry, the Union was losing the war. And part of the reason why they were using the war is because the slaves in the South were being used as labor and logistical handymen to equip the South to fight the North. So the Union was fighting shorthanded because a significant part of their population was disallowed to participate, black folks. So in January 1st, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation came out. Look them both up, the preliminary one and the actual Emancipation Proclamation. Colonization is taken out. You can still look at both of them. They're not changed. It's still on the internet. But colonization is taken out. And what they put in it is black people can serve. So now you have poor whites in the North fighting for their economic interests of Western expansion, gaining money. The rich Northern whites are benefiting from the poor whites getting money because they're going to lower the taxes. And of course, you have the Southerners fighting in unison for slavery, not just for the economics of slavery, but their culture of slavery, because white superiority and supremacy was as much part of their social culture as it was their economic culture. And we'll get into that into different videos as to where the mindset of what is articulated in Jim Crow black codes was derived from the understood dynamics of Southern slaveocracy. Well, when blacks entered into this fray, January 1st of 1863, the war shifted in favor of the North. Now there's some people who will say, well, no matter what, Lincoln led it, so Lincoln freed the slaves. Lincoln did not free the slaves. Lincoln transformed slavery. Only after colonization failed, because he tried to send a bunch of black people to the Caribbean and it didn't work out. I'll do another video on that. Ile de Vache is the most famous one. That's in Haiti. What Lincoln did was he negotiated slavery. He removed slavery from the private sector, which he could not trust or control, to the public sector, which he could control. And this is how the 13th Amendment is written now. It says you cannot have slavery or involuntary servitude except if you have been, if it is for punishment of a crime, which means slavery, in this exception, is governed by the judiciary. Now, do we have any proof that that was immediately the desire for the outcome of that? Yes. And there's another video we're going to do actually on the 13th Amendment, just the wording of the 13th Amendment, because that goes all the way back to the Ohio State Constitution, the Illinois State Constitution, which Lincoln was a legislator in Illinois, so he would be aware of this wording and the outcome that it brings. So he did not ever have any intention of freeing the slave or abolishing slavery. Slavery was never abolished. Okay? Wasn't. If it says you can't have it except in this case, that means you can have it under this situation. And he particularly named who governs it, which is the judiciary. So the only people who fought for that progression of what black people got in the Civil War, because I'm not going to say black people didn't get anything from the Civil War, but what black people got from the Civil War was won and gotten by black people. Those black regiments, Harriet Tubman, who led raids in the Civil War, Martin Delany, these people like that, those blacks who were out there fighting for their freedom, because black people have been fighting for their freedom. They first did that in the Revolutionary War. So this wasn't new. When they knew, oh, war coming, let's go. Frederick Douglass pushed for the Civil War for that same reason. So whites, northern poor whites, got what they wanted, Western expansion. Rich whites, northern, got the taxes down to 50% because they gave all of these programs which when it's done for black people and poor people or non-white people, it's called socialism, but that's a different video. And the Southerners got to maintain slavery because in 1865, the same year, the proof why Lincoln wrote it the way he wrote it, the same year, they started convict leasing, where they just took the people they freed and made up laws that freed people with no home, no land, no economic floor. I'm freed with my family. They gotta eat. You gonna let your kids starve? No, you're gonna steal a pig. You're gonna steal a chicken. Oh, you're stealing. Gotta go to jail. Oh, you're loitering. Gotta go to jail. Oh, you don't have a letter showing that you have a job. They just freed 4 million people. So they arrest them up and they send them to jail. Well, the jails can't hold 4 million people, right? So where'd they send them? Oh, we're gonna lease them to businessmen that can use them. The same plantations they took them from. Great book about this. It's called Slavery by Another Name by Blackman. Douglas Blackman. Slavery by Another Name goes into convict leasing. So everybody got what they were fighting for. Blacks got more freedom, but still obviously had to fight through another 100 years of second-class citizenship. But the clarity that we need is that black people fought for black people's freedom in the Civil War. No one else did.